Sometimes the most broken hearts hide behind the biggest smiles. Julian Ware had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. At 52, the music mogul had built an empire, using people's dreams against them. His charity galas drew the elite. His reputation for ruthless dealings preceded him everywhere. But one evening at a gala, honoring his late mother, a scruffy orphan Lila wandered into his world with nothing but a tattered backpack and a voice that shattered everything he knew. What happens when a man running from his past meets a child who forces him to face it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from tonight. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for all of you wonderful people who've been faithfully following along with us on this incredible journey together here. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian Ware's penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. From the 42nd floor of his Manhattan tower, the city sprawled beneath him like a vast kingdom, one he had conquered note by note, contract by contract, dream by broken dream. He stood at the window in his silk robe, coffee growing cold in his manicured hands, watching the ant-like figures scurry along the sidewalks below. They reminded him of the aspiring musicians who once lined up outside his office, clutching demo tapes and wearing hope like cheap cologne. That was before streaming changed everything, before he learned that owning the distribution meant owning the artists themselves. The penthouse reflected his success with surgical precision. Italian leather furniture arranged at perfect angles, abstract art that cost more than most people's homes, and a wine collection that could fund a small orchestra for a year. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was sentimental, except for the piano. His mother's 1952 Steinway Model M sat in the corner of the living room like an elegant ghost, its ebony surface reflecting the morning light. Eleanor Ware's initials were still etched delicately into the music stand, a reminder of evenings when this very room had been filled with Chopin and Debussy instead of the calculated silence that now reigned. Julian's fingers unconsciously traced the rim of his coffee cup, the same nervous habit he'd developed as a child when his mother would practice for hours, her delicate hands dancing across the keys while he did homework at the kitchen table. She had been a concert pianist before she married his father, before she chose family over Carnegie Hall, before arthritis stole her gift, one joint at a time. Julian remembered how she would still play, even when her fingers betrayed her, her face contorting with pain and something deeper, regret perhaps, or the ghost of what might have been. Music isn't about the money. Julian, she had told him during her final days, her voice barely a whisper in the hospital bed. It's about touching something eternal in the human heart. He had nodded then, holding her fragile hand, but her words felt like poetry, beautiful, impractical, and utterly disconnected from the brutal realities of the music industry. Within 6 months of her death, he had transformed her small talent agency into a multimedia empire, signing artists to contracts that would have made his mother weep. The irony wasn't lost on him that tonight's charity gala, the 5th annual Eleanor Ware Foundation benefit, would raise money for music education in underprivileged schools. The same children whose neighborhoods he had gentrified, whose local venues he had priced out of existence, would benefit from his tax-deductible generosity. His mother would have seen through the performance, but his mother was 10 years in the ground, and the living had bills to pay. Marcus, his personal assistant, appeared in the doorway with the practiced invisibility of expensive help. Tall, efficient, and loyal as a Swiss bank account, Marcus had been managing Julian's life for 7 years without ever asking uncomfortable questions or offering unwanted opinions. The final headcount for tonight is 312, Marcus reported, consulting his tablet. Chef Ramirez confirms the menu is set, and the string quartet will arrive at 5 for sound check. Mrs. Henderson called to confirm her table donation of $50,000, and Senator Williams' office sent regrets. He'll be in Washington for the vote. Julian nodded, his attention still caught by the piano. Sometimes, late at night, after too much wine, he would sit at the bench and place his fingers on the keys. He never played, hadn't played since his mother's funeral, but the cool ivory felt like a connection to something he couldn't name. "And the auction items?" Julian asked, finally turning from the window. "All confirmed. The signed Beatles memorabilia, the weekend in the Hamptons, and the crown jewel, a private recording session at Abbey Road Studios." Marcus paused, consulting his notes. "Mr. Patterson from the Times wants to interview you about the Foundation's impact. I've scheduled him for 30 minutes at 7. Julian's mouth curved into what passed for a smile. Patterson would write exactly what Julian wanted him to write. A glowing piece about the successful businessman giving back to the community, complete with tasteful mentions of his mother's legacy and his own humble beginnings. The truth was more complicated, but truth rarely sold newspapers or attracted donors. "What about security?" Julian asked, moving toward his home office. The walls were lined with gold and platinum records, his artist's success captured in frames, each one representing millions in revenue and thousands in actual artist payments. Standard protocol. Velvet rope barriers, invitation-only entry, and Mr. Thompson's team will handle the perimeter. Marcus followed, maintaining the precise distance that expensive training provided. "The children's choir from Sacred Heart will perform at 8:30. As Mrs. Rodriguez requested." Julian paused at his desk, fingers drumming against the mahogany surface. Mrs. Rodriguez ran the youth program at Sacred Heart, one of the few genuine people in his orbit. A former teacher who actually believed music could save souls instead of just bank accounts. Her kids would sing their hearts out tonight for an audience that would applaud politely while mentally calculating tax benefits. His office window faced east, toward the Hudson River and the sprawling developments that bore his company's name. Ware Entertainment had its fingers in every aspect of the industry: record labels, streaming platforms, venue management, and artist development programs that developed very little except debt. He had built an empire on the simple principle that talent was renewable, but capital was not. The photograph on his desk showed a different Julian, younger, softer around the edges, standing next to a woman with kind eyes and a little girl with pigtails. Sarah and Emma, his ex-wife and daughter, casualties of his ascent to the top. The photo was 5 years old now, taken during what had been their last family vacation before the divorce became final. Emma would be 11 now, probably playing soccer and learning piano, if Sarah had kept their agreement about music lessons. He sent the child support checks religiously, attended the mandatory school events when his schedule allowed, and maintained the polite fiction that he was still a father in any meaningful sense of the word. "Sir?" Marcus's voice cut through his reverie. "The car will be here at 6 to take you to the venue. Would you like me to review the donor list once more?" Julian nodded, settling into his leather chair and opening the file Marcus had prepared. 300 names, each with a detailed profile, net worth, giving history, personal connections, and strategic value. These weren't friends. They were investments. Each conversation tonight would be choreographed, each handshake calculated to maximize return. The morning stretched ahead with its familiar rhythm, calls with distributors in Los Angeles, a meeting with the legal team about contract restructuring, and a conference with his public relations firm about damage control for an artist who had been photographed leaving a rehabilitation facility. Business as usual in an industry built on managed chaos. As Marcus retreated to coordinate the evening's final details, Julian found himself drawn back to the piano. He approached it slowly like a man visiting a grave, and lifted the bench lid to reveal the sheet music his mother had left behind. Chopin's Nocturne, Debussy's Clair de Lune, and beneath them a composition in his mother's careful handwriting, "For Julian, with love." He had never played the piece she had written for him, had never even tried to read the notes that spelled out her hopes for his future. Tonight, after the last donor had been charmed and the final check had been written, he would return to this piano and this silence. measuring his success against the growing emptiness that no amount of money seemed to fill. The foundation bearing his mother's name would raise perhaps $500,000 tonight. Enough to fund music programs for a year, enough to generate excellent publicity, and enough to remind everyone that Julian Ware had a heart beneath the expensive suits and calculated smile. But Eleanor Ware had wanted something different for her son. She had wanted him to understand that the most beautiful music came from the deepest places, from the broken and hopeful spaces that money could neither buy nor heal. She had wanted him to learn that success without soul was just elaborate noise. As the morning wore on and the penthouse filled with the quiet efficiency of preparation, Julian prepared for another performance, the carefully orchestrated evening where he would play the role of the grateful son, the generous benefactor, and the successful entrepreneur. He would wear his mother's memory like a well-tailored tuxedo, and everyone would applaud his transformation of grief into generosity. None of them would see the man who stood alone at his window each morning, looking out at the city he had conquered while wondering what he had lost in the victory. None of them would know about the sheet music gathering dust in the piano bench, or the daughter who had stopped calling him daddy, or the dreams he had traded for quarterly profit reports. Tonight would be perfect, like all his events. And tomorrow, he would wake up in this beautiful, silent penthouse and measure his success against the echoes of his mother's unfulfilled hopes. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel sparkled like a jewel box, its crystal chandeliers casting warm light over the carefully arranged tables draped in ivory silk. Julian moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his tuxedo tailored to perfection, his smile calibrated to suggest warmth without promising intimacy. The Eleanor Ware Foundation's 5th annual benefit was unfolding exactly as planned, a symphony of wealth and philanthropy that would generate headlines and tax write-offs in equal measure. Julian, "Darling!" Margaret Henderson swept toward him, her diamond necklace catching the light like captured stars. "The venue is absolutely exquisite. Your mother would be so proud." He accepted her air kisses with the same grace he reserved for board meetings, his hand briefly touching her elbow, in a gesture that conveyed just enough personal connection to ensure her continued generosity. "Margaret, you're too kind. Your table donation will fund 3 full scholarship programs this year." The conversation followed its predictable arc: mutual admiration, subtle mentions of tax benefits, and carefully choreographed gratitude. Julian had perfected this dance over countless galas, transforming genuine need into elegant entertainment for people who had never known genuine need themselves. Senator Williams's absence had created a useful opening at the head table, now filled by the mayor's wife and her enthusiasm for arts education. The evening's program would unfold in carefully timed segments: cocktails and networking, dinner with the children's choir performance, the auction, and finally, the presentation of the Foundation's annual impact report. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event coordinator announced over the discreet sound system, "please take your seats for this evening's program." Julian made his way to the podium, surveying the sea of familiar faces, titans of industry, political figures, and cultural tastemakers who comprised his personal ecosystem. These were the people who bought his artists' music, attended his venues, and invested in his various enterprises. Tonight, they would also fund music education for children they would never meet, in neighborhoods they would never visit. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to monetize sentiment. "We gather tonight not just to honor my mother's memory, but to ensure that her belief in music's transformative power continues to change young lives." The applause was polite, appreciative, and perfectly timed. Julian continued with anecdotes about Eleanor Ware's dedication to music education, her volunteer work at local schools, and her unwavering belief that every child deserved access to artistic expression. He had delivered variations of this speech for 5 years now, each iteration more polished than the last. The children's choir from Sacred Heart took their positions near the piano. 23 young voices arranged by height, their faces scrubbed clean and their second-hand formal wear pressed to perfection. Mrs. Rodriguez conducted with gentle authority, her weathered hands coaxing angelic sounds from children who knew more about struggle than most of the audience would learn in a lifetime. As their final note faded into appreciative applause, Julian returned to the microphone for the evening's next phase, the auction that would generate the majority of the night's revenue. The Beatles' memorabilia went for $35,000, the Hamptons weekend for $28,000, and the Abbey Road session for a satisfying $42,000. It was during the brief transition between auction and dessert that the evening's careful choreography stumbled. Child appeared at the ballroom's service entrance, a small girl with tangled hair and clothes that suggested she had traveled far to reach this place. She clutched a faded purple backpack against her chest like armor, her eyes wide as she took in the opulence that surrounded her. The security team moved toward her with professional discretion, but she had already caught the attention of several nearby tables. Julian noticed her immediately, his practiced eye cataloging the incongruity she represented, poverty amid plenty, chaos within his carefully ordered event. She couldn't be more than 6 or 7, small for her age, with the careful alertness of a child who had learned too early that the world was not designed for her protection. "Excuse me," she said to the nearest waiter, her voice barely above a whisper, "is this where they help kids with music?" The question carried across the suddenly quiet ballroom with startling clarity. Conversations paused, champagne glasses suspended midway to lips, as 300 guests turned to stare at the child who had somehow breached their exclusive gathering. Julian felt the familiar calculation begin. Damage control scenarios, public relations opportunities, ways to transform this unexpected disruption into a demonstration of his compassion. The child represented a perfect photo opportunity if managed correctly, a living symbol of the Foundation's mission standing before its benefactors. "Well," he said, approaching the microphone with the confidence of a man who had never met a situation he couldn't monetize, "it appears we have a special guest tonight." The crowd's attention shifted between Julian and the child, sensing drama but uncertain of its direction. She stood frozen near the entrance, her backpack now pressed against her side, her eyes fixed on Julian with an intensity that momentarily unsettled him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced charm. "Lila," she whispered, then louder, "Lila May. And how did you find your way to our little party, Lila May?" Julian's tone suggested gentle amusement, the indulgent adult speaking to a charming but misguided child. Several guests chuckled appreciatively, recognizing the setup for what they assumed would be a heartwarming moment. "Mrs. Rodriguez told me about the music lady," Lila said, gesturing vaguely toward the choir director who now watched with growing concern. "She said maybe someone here could help me learn piano like my mama did." The mention of Mrs. Rodriguez created a connection Julian couldn't dismiss outright. The woman ran legitimate programs, had genuine credibility, and her presence at the event gave the child a thin veneer of legitimacy. But the situation required careful handling to prevent it from derailing the evening's careful momentum. "Well, Lila May," Julian said, his voice now carrying a note of theatrical consideration, "the Foundation certainly believes in supporting young musicians. But tell me, can you sing?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Julian had intended it as a gentle deflection, a way to acknowledge the child's presence while maintaining control of the narrative. He expected her to shake her head shyly, perhaps retreat to Mrs. Rodriguez's protective shadow, allowing him to demonstrate his kindness with a small gesture before returning to the evening's business. Instead, Lila May nodded solemnly, her grip on the backpack tightening. "Then here's what we'll do," Julian continued, his tone becoming more theatrical as he sensed the crowd's growing engagement with the improvised drama. "Why don't you sing us a little something? If you can make these good people happy with your voice, maybe, just maybe, I'll consider adopting you myself." The words left his mouth before he fully realized their cruelty. The audience laughed appreciatively, recognizing the joke for what it was, a wealthy man's playful banter with an amusing interruption. Several people applauded the improvised entertainment, delighted by this unexpected addition to the evening's program. But Mrs. Rodriguez's face had gone pale, and something in Lila May's expression shifted, not hurt exactly, but a kind of resigned understanding that told Julian she had heard such jokes before, had learned to expect mockery disguised as kindness. "Okay," she said simply, setting her backpack down with careful deliberation. The single word carried such quiet dignity that the ballroom's laughter faded into expectant silence. Julian found himself caught between his assumption that the child would retreat and the growing realization that she intended to call his bluff. Lila May stepped forward, away from the safety of the entrance and into the center of the ballroom. The chandeliers cast shadows across her face, highlighting the determined set of her small jaw and the way her hands had stopped trembling. She looked directly at Julian, then at the crowd of faces surrounding her, and opened her mouth to sing. What emerged was not the uncertain warble Julian had expected from a nervous child performing before strangers. Instead, Lila May's voice filled the ballroom with a clarity and power that seemed impossible from such a small frame. A sound that carried pain and hope in equal measure, raw emotion unfiltered by technique or training. She sang without accompaniment, without amplification, and without the safety net of familiar surroundings. Her song was simple, a melody that seemed to draw from gospel and blues and something deeper still, words about finding home and holding on to dreams when everything else disappeared. The ballroom had become completely silent. 300 guests frozen in recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Julian stood at the microphone, his prepared quips and practiced charm suddenly feeling hollow against the devastating honesty of the child's voice. As her final note faded into silence, Julian realized that his carefully constructed evening, and perhaps something much deeper, had been irreversibly changed by a 6-year-old with a purple backpack and a voice that carried the weight of longing he had spent decades trying to forget. The silence that followed Lila May's song stretched for what felt like an eternity, though Julian's watch would later tell him it lasted only 17 seconds. 17 seconds during which 300 of Manhattan's most influential people sat frozen, their champagne glasses suspended, their conversations abandoned, their carefully maintained social armor temporarily pierced by the raw honesty of a child's voice. Then the applause began, not the polite, measured clapping that had accompanied the evening's other performances, but something spontaneous and genuine. It started with Mrs. Rodriguez, her weathered hands creating a rhythm that others quickly joined. Within moments, the entire ballroom was on its feet, offering the kind of ovation usually reserved for Carnegie Hall premieres or Broadway opening nights. Julian remained at the podium, his hands gripping the microphone stand as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He watched Lila May accept the applause with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout her performance, her small frame somehow containing more grace than he had managed in 52 years of carefully orchestrated public appearances. "Ladies and gentlemen," he heard himself say, though the words seemed to come from someone else, "I think we can all agree that was unexpected." The understatement drew appreciative laughter, but Julian's attention remained fixed on the child. She had bent to retrieve her purple backpack, her movements careful and precise, as if she understood that this moment balanced on a knife's edge between triumph and dismissal. Margaret Henderson leaned toward her companion, her voice carrying in the way that expensive whispers often did. Remarkable, really, though one does wonder where exactly she came from. The comment, casual, thoughtless, tinged with the unconscious cruelty of privilege, hit Julian like cold water. He recognized the tone, because he had used it himself countless times, the way the wealthy discuss the poor as if they were weather phenomena, rather than human beings. Mrs. Rodriguez had moved protectively toward Lila May, her expression suggesting she understood the precarious nature of the child's situation. Julian caught her eye and saw something there that unsettled him, not gratitude for his impromptu entertainment, but concern for what would happen next. "Mr. Ware," called James Patterson from the Times, his reporter's instincts recognizing a story in progress. "Will you be following through on your adoption offer?" The question landed like a physical blow. Julian felt the weight of 300 expectant gazes, the pressure of cameras that had materialized from nowhere, and the crushing realization that his thoughtless joke had become a public commitment. In his peripheral vision, he caught sight of Lila May's face, not hopeful exactly, but watching with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read adults' intentions for signs of safety or danger. "Well," Julian began, his voice carrying across the now quiet ballroom, "I think we should focus on the incredible talent we've just witnessed." "But you did promise," interrupted Caroline Wu, a prominent socialite known for her directness, "in front of all of us. Surely a man of your stature honors his commitments." Julian felt the familiar sensation of a business deal spinning beyond his control. But this wasn't a contract negotiation or a board meeting where he could deploy his usual arsenal of deflection and delay. This was a 6-year-old child whose performance had somehow stripped away every defense he had spent decades constructing. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should discuss the details privately. Tonight is about celebrating the Foundation's work." "Oh, don't be modest," Margaret Henderson called out, her voice bright with the enthusiasm of someone who sensed drama unfolding. "This is exactly what Eleanor would have wanted. Direct action, immediate help for a deserving child." The invocation of his mother's name felt like sacrilege, though Julian couldn't articulate why. Eleanor Ware had indeed believed in helping children, in the transformative power of music, in making concrete differences in individual lives. But she had also been fiercely protective of the vulnerable, careful never to exploit need for public gain. Julian descended from the podium, his movements feeling disconnected from his intentions. Each step toward Lila May seemed to carry weight beyond simple locomotion, as if he were crossing some invisible boundary between his carefully managed public persona and something more dangerous, genuine human connection. "Lila May," he said, crouching down to meet her eyes. "That was beautiful, truly beautiful." Up close, he could see the details that distance had obscured, the way her dress had been carefully mended, the scuffed shoes that had been polished to shine despite their age, the purple backpack that bore the wear patterns of someone who carried everything important with them. She smelled like cheap soap and determination, a combination that brought unexpected memories of his own daughter. Emma had been roughly this age when she had first asked to learn piano, her small hands barely spanning an octave on the keys. Sarah had enrolled her in lessons despite Julian's protests about the expense, the time commitment, the impracticality of artistic pursuits in a competitive world. He remembered Emma's excitement after her first recital, the way she had bounced on her toes while describing the piece she had played. "What song was that?" he asked Lila May, pushing away the memory of Emma's voice. "It's called Somewhere to Belong," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mama taught it to me before she went away." The simple statement carried implications that Julian wasn't prepared to process. Behind Lila May, Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward with the protective instincts of someone who had seen too many children navigate systems designed to help them, but often failing in the execution. "Mr. Ware," she said quietly, "perhaps we could speak privately about Lila's situation. She's been staying at Sacred Heart's temporary housing program while we work on more permanent arrangements." The words "temporary housing program" hit Julian with unexpected force. This wasn't a child with a stable home who had wandered into his gala on a whim. This was someone genuinely in need, someone whose performance had been not entertainment, but a desperate attempt to find safety in an uncertain world. Of course, Julian heard himself say, though part of his mind was already calculating the public relations implications of whatever choice he made next. Perhaps we could, Mr. Ware. A voice called from across the ballroom. Channel 7 News, can you comment on your adoption plans? The cameras had multiplied somehow, and Julian realized with growing horror that this moment was being broadcast, recorded, documented for posterity. His thoughtless joke had become a public commitment, and now the machinery of media attention was grinding into motion around a child who had simply wanted to sing. He looked down at Lila May, who was watching the approaching cameras with the wariness of someone much older than her years. In her eyes, he saw something that made his chest tighten, not expectation or hope, but the resigned understanding that adults often made promises they didn't intend to keep. "We should go," he said quietly to Mrs. Rodriguez, his protective instincts surprising him with their intensity. Somewhere private. But even as he spoke, Julian knew that privacy was no longer an option. Whatever happened next would unfold under public scrutiny, with consequences that extended far beyond a single evening's entertainment. He had inadvertently made Lila May's story part of his own, and now he would have to decide whether that story ended with disappointment, or something more transformative than either of them was. Prepared to imagine, the hotel manager's office was a stark contrast to the ballroom's opulence, functional furniture, fluorescent lighting, and the lingering scent of industrial coffee. Julian had retreated here with Mrs. Rodriguez and Lila May, leaving Marcus to manage the media circus that had erupted around his impromptu adoption offer. Through the thin walls, he could hear the murmur of continued conversations as guests processed the evening's unexpected turn. Lila May sat in an oversized chair, her purple backpack balanced carefully on her lap, her legs swinging several inches above the floor. She hadn't spoken since leaving the ballroom, but her eyes tracked every movement with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety was temporary and adults were unpredictable. Mrs. Rodriguez settled into the chair beside her with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades working with children in crisis. Her weathered face carried lines that spoke of late nights, difficult conversations, and the accumulated weight of trying to fix problems that society preferred to ignore. "I need to apologize," Julian began, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of uncertainty. The adoption comment, that was thoughtless. Cruel, even. It was, Mrs. Rodriguez agreed without hesitation, her directness cutting through his attempted diplomacy. But here we are, and Lila heard it, and 300 people heard it. And now there are cameras asking questions. Julian ran his hand through his hair, disrupting the careful styling that had been perfect when the evening began. "Tell me about her situation. Really tell me." Mrs. Rodriguez glanced at Lila May, who nodded slightly, a gesture so small it might have been missed by someone not trained to read children's silent communications. Lila's mother was Maria Santos, Mrs. Rodriguez began, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. A beautiful woman, a talented singer who worked nights at clubs in the village to support them both. She died 6 months ago. Overdose, the coroner said, though those of us who knew her suspected it was more complicated than that. The words hit Julian like a physical blow. He had expected a story of temporary hardship, family crisis, perhaps divorce or job loss, problems that money could solve with elegant efficiency. Drug addiction carried implications that money alone couldn't address. Complexities that extended far beyond simple charity. Maria was trying to get clean, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her tone carrying no judgment, only tired sadness. She'd been in and out of programs for 2 years, working so hard to be the mother Lila deserved. But addiction, it's not a character flaw or a moral failing. It's a disease, and sometimes the disease wins. Lila May reached into her backpack and withdrew a small object, a photograph so worn from handling that the edges had begun to fray. She held it out to Julian with the solemnity of someone sharing sacred relics. The image showed a young woman with Lila's eyes and a radiant smile, holding a guitar and looking directly at the camera with the confidence of someone who believed in music's power to transform lives. Even in the faded photograph, Maria Santos's resemblance to her daughter was unmistakable. The same delicate features, the same intensity of expression. She was beautiful, Julian said softly. Returning the photograph to Lila's careful hands, she was. Lila May spoke for the first time since leaving the ballroom, her voice barely above a whisper. She taught me that song, said it was about finding your people, the ones who understand your heart. The simple statement carried weight that made Julian's chest tighten. He thought of his own daughter, Emma, and the casual way he had dismissed her musical interests as impractical distractions. The contrast between his privileged neglect and this child's desperate gratitude for whatever musical connection she could maintain felt like a judgment on his character. What happens now? Julian asked Mrs. Rodriguez, though he wasn't certain he wanted to hear the answer. Officially, Lila is in temporary custody of the state while we search for appropriate placement. She's been staying at Sacred Heart's emergency housing because our regular placements are full, have been for months. Mrs. Rodriguez's tone carried the exhaustion of someone fighting a system designed to process rather than heal. The reality is that she'll likely age out before finding a permanent home. Age out? Julian's business experience had taught him to recognize euphemisms, but this one was unfamiliar. Turn 18 without finding a family, Lila May answered, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing weather rather than her future. Happens to lots of kids. The casual acceptance in her voice was somehow worse than if she had cried or raged against the injustice. Julian realized he was looking at a 6-year-old who had already internalized the statistical likelihood of her own abandonment, who had learned to expect nothing and be grateful for temporary kindness. Your comment tonight, Mrs. Rodriguez said carefully, it's created a situation. The media attention, the public interest. It could be helpful or harmful depending on how it's handled. Julian understood the subtext. His public adoption offer had transformed Lila May from an anonymous child in the system to a symbol, a story that would be told with or without his participation. How that story ended would reflect not only on him, but on every other child waiting for families that might never come. What would adoption actually involve? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Mrs. Rodriguez studied his face with the intensity of someone trained to read motivations behind generous offers. Home studies, background checks, psychological evaluations, financial assessments. 6 to 18 months of supervision and support. And that's assuming you're approved, assuming I'm approved. Single men over 50 with demanding careers don't fit the typical adoptive parent profile, she said bluntly, especially for a child with Lila's background. There would be questions about your ability to provide emotional stability, consistent presence, age-appropriate understanding of trauma response. Each requirement felt like a wall rising between intention and action, between the impulse to help and the reality of what help actually required. Julian had built his empire by identifying obstacles and systematically dismantling them, but child welfare operated by different rules than corporate mergers. I have resources, he said, falling back on the solution that had always worked before. The best schools, the finest music teachers, whatever she needs. What she needs, Mrs. Rodriguez interrupted gently, is someone who understands that healing happens in small moments, not grand gestures. Someone who can sit with her during nightmares about her mother, who can help her process trauma that goes deeper than material poverty. Julian looked at Lila May, who was carefully placing the photograph back in her backpack with the reverence of someone handling priceless treasure. Her movements were precise, economical, carrying the efficiency of someone who had learned to pack quickly when circumstances changed without warning. Why music? He asked her directly. She looked up with those enormous eyes that seemed to contain far too much understanding for someone her age. Mama said music was the only thing nobody could take away from you. Even when everything else disappeared, you still had the songs in your heart. The answer cut through Julian's defenses with surgical precision, revealing the hollow space where his own connection to music used to live. He had spent decades treating melody as commodity, rhythm as market research, harmony as profit margin. This child understood something about music's essential nature that his empire had systematically destroyed within him. Outside, Marcus was undoubtedly fielding calls from reporters, publicists, and board members who would all have opinions about how this situation should be managed. But here in this small office, with a 6-year-old holding her mother's photograph and a social worker who had dedicated her life to impossible cases, Julian felt the weight of a choice that money couldn't purchase and public relations couldn't spin. The question was no longer whether he could adopt Lila May, but whether he was capable of becoming the kind of person who deserved to. Julian returned to his penthouse at nearly midnight, the weight of the evening's events settling around him like a heavy coat he couldn't remove. The gala had continued after his departure, Marcus ensuring that donors remained engaged and checks continued to flow. But Julian's mind had been elsewhere, trapped in a hotel manager's office with a 6-year-old who had somehow upended his carefully constructed world with nothing more than her voice. The apartment felt different now, its pristine silence no longer comforting but oppressive. Every expensive surface seemed to mock the memory of Lila May's careful poverty, her threadbare dress and scuffed shoes that had been polished to dignity despite their age. Julian poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, 18-year-old Macallan that cost more than most people. He spent on groceries in a month and stood at his window looking out at the city that had once felt like his kingdom. His phone buzzed constantly, with messages from board members, reporters, and curious friends who had heard about the evening's unexpected drama. He ignored them all, his attention caught by his reflection in the window glass, a successful man in an expensive tuxedo, holding expensive liquor in his expensive apartment, and feeling more lost than he had since his mother's death. The piano drew him as it always did in moments of crisis. Julian approached his mother's Steinway with the hesitation of someone visiting a grave, lifting the bench lid to reveal the sheet music that had remained untouched for 5 years. Beneath Chopin's Nocturnes and Debussy's Clair de Lune lay the composition his mother had written for him, her careful handwriting spelling out notes he had never attempted to play. But tonight, his attention was caught by something else, a small digital recorder he had forgotten placing there years ago. Emma's voice emerged when he pressed play, tinny through the device's small speaker, but unmistakably his daughter at age 7. Painstakingly working through a simple Mozart piece. "Daddy, listen," her recorded voice commanded, with the imperious tone of a child accustomed to adult attention. "I learned the whole thing by myself. The melody that followed was imperfect, notes slightly off-tempo, fingers occasionally stumbling over transitions, but infused with the pure joy of discovery that Julian remembered from those early days when Emma's enthusiasm for piano had been a source of family delight rather than schedule disruption. He had made the recording during one of her first recitals, back when he still attended such events, before his expanding business empire had consumed every evening and weekend. Sarah had asked him to document Emma's progress, to create memories they could share when she was older. Instead, the recorder had ended up buried beneath sheet music, while Julian pursued increasingly complex business deals that promised everything except presence in his daughter's life. That was beautiful. "Sweetheart," his own voice responded on the recording, and Julian was startled by how different he had sounded then. Younger, certainly, but also more connected to something beyond quarterly earnings and market share. "Will you play with me, Daddy?" Emma's recorded voice asked, with the casual confidence of a child who had not yet learned that adults often said no to requests that mattered. "Maybe later, honey. Daddy has some work to finish." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, Emma describing her lesson, Julian offering distracted encouragement while clearly focused on other matters. When the recording ended, Julian sat in silence, remembering how that evening had unfolded. He had indeed finished his work, a contract negotiation that had added several million to his net worth, but he had never returned to play piano with his daughter. There had always been another deal, another opportunity, another urgent matter that took precedence over 7-year-old fingers struggling with Mozart. By the time Emma was 10, she had stopped asking him to listen to her practice. By 12, she had stopped playing altogether, declaring music boring in the way children do when they've learned that their passions aren't valued by the people who matter most. Julian pressed play again, subjecting himself to the ghost of his own neglect. This time, he heard details that had escaped him before, the slight tremor in Emma's voice when she asked him to play with her, the pause that suggested she had been hoping for a different response, the careful way she had accepted his deflection without argument. He had taught his daughter that music was less important than business, that artistic passion was a luxury rather than a necessity, that love could be expressed through material provision rather than shared experience. Now, years later, Emma lived with her mother in Connecticut, visited him on mandatory weekends, and showed no interest in the piano that had once filled her with such joy. The comparison to Lila May was inevitable and devastating. Where Emma had received every material advantage, excellent schools, private lessons, a stable home, she had been taught to devalue the very thing that Lila May understood as sacred. Where Lila May clutched her mother's musical legacy with desperate reverence, Emma had abandoned hers with the casual indifference of someone who had too much to appreciate anything. Julian's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Saw the news about tonight. Emma wants to know if you're really adopting someone." The message hit him like ice water. His daughter had learned about his public adoption offer through media coverage rather than direct communication, another failure in a relationship built on accumulated absences and misplaced priorities. He started to type several responses, each one feeling inadequate. How could he explain that he had made a thoughtless joke that had somehow become a moral imperative? How could he describe the way Lila May's voice had awakened something in him that years of therapy and self-reflection had failed to touch? Instead, he called. "Julian?" Sarah's voice carried the careful neutrality she had developed during their divorce proceedings. "It's late. I know. I'm sorry. Emma saw the news. It's everywhere. Social media, morning show previews, even CNN picked it up." Sarah's tone suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "She's confused." "Honestly, so am I." Julian closed his eyes, imagining his 11-year-old daughter trying to process why her father would publicly offer to adopt a stranger when their own relationship remained so fractured. "It wasn't planned," he said finally. "The child, Lila, she appeared at the gala tonight. Her voice was, 'Sarah, I can't explain what happened when she sang. You made a public commitment to adopt her.' I made a joke. A cruel joke, actually. But then she sang and—" Julian struggled to find words for an experience that had bypassed rational thought entirely. It was like hearing Emma play that first Mozart piece. Except this child has lost everything, and music is all she has left. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Julian to wonder if the call had dropped. "Emma stopped playing," Sarah said finally, her voice soft with old sadness. "Did you know that? Completely stopped after you missed her spring recital 3 years ago." The information hit him like a physical blow. He had known about the missed recital, an unavoidable conflict, with a board meeting that had seemed important at the time, but he hadn't realized it had marked the end of Emma's musical journey. She was playing Chopin, Sarah continued, "the same nocturne your mother used to play. She had practiced for months, and when you didn't show up, I sent flowers," Julian interrupted weakly. "You sent Marcus with flowers. There's a difference." The rebuke was gentle but devastating. Julian remembered now, the last-minute text to Marcus, the assumption that expensive arrangements could substitute for presence, the casual dismissal of what had clearly been an important moment in his daughter's life. "I want to fix this," he said, though he wasn't certain whether he meant his relationship with Emma, his commitment to Lila May, or something deeper that encompassed both. "I hope you do," Sarah replied. "For both girls' sake." After the call ended, Julian sat at his mother's piano, surrounded by the artifacts of relationships he had damaged through neglect and misplaced priorities. Emma's recording, his mother's sheet music, and now the memory of Lila May's voice, all testimonies to the power of music to connect hearts across the distances that money and success could never bridge. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether he was truly ready to become the kind of father that Lila May deserved, or whether his public adoption offer would become another promise broken by a man who had confused wealth with worth. The Children's Services office on Lower Manhattan felt like stepping into a different universe from Julian's usual environment. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on institutional furniture that had been selected for durability rather than comfort. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and resignation, filled with people whose stories Julian could only imagine: young mothers clutching babies, elderly couples with worried expressions, social workers carrying case files thick with human complexity. Julian sat in a plastic chair beside his lawyer, David Morrison, who had spent the previous 3 days trying to explain why adopting a child wasn't like acquiring a company. The paperwork spread across the small table before them resembled a merger agreement in its complexity, but dealt with issues no business school had prepared him to navigate. "The home study will be extensive," David explained for the 3rd time, his voice carrying the patience of someone addressing a particularly stubborn client. "They'll evaluate everything: your living situation, financial stability, emotional readiness, support systems, understanding of child development and trauma response." Julian nodded, though his attention kept drifting to the other families in the waiting room. A young father held a sleeping infant while reviewing documents with a social worker, his face showing the exhaustion of someone fighting systems designed to help, but often failing in execution. An older woman sat alone, her hands folded over a manila folder, her expression suggesting she had been waiting for news that might never come. "Mr. Ware," a voice called from across the room. "Ms. Patterson will see you now." The social worker who greeted them was younger than Julian had expected, with prematurely grey hair and the efficient compassion of someone who had learned to balance hope with realism. Her office was small but warm, decorated with children's artwork and photographs that spoke of successful placements, families created through paperwork and persistence. "I've reviewed your initial application," Ms. Patterson began, settling behind her desk with Julian's file. "I'll be honest, your case is unusual. Most adoption inquiries don't begin with viral videos and media coverage." Julian winced at the reminder. The footage from the gala had indeed gone viral, shared across social platforms with captions ranging from heartwarming to cynical. Whose adoption promise had become a trending hashtag, with commentators debating everything from his sincerity to his qualifications as a potential parent. "I understand the optics are complicated," Julian said carefully, "but my commitment to Lila May is genuine." "I hope so," Miss Patterson replied, her tone suggesting she had heard similar assurances before. "Because adoption isn't a charity project or a public relations opportunity. It's creating a family with all the messy, difficult, lifelong responsibilities that entails." She opened his file and began reading from a checklist that seemed designed to catalogue every aspect of his life. "You're 52, never married, no biological children, demanding career that requires extensive travel. Your previous relationship with your stepdaughter ended when you divorced her mother." "Biological daughter," Julian corrected quietly. "Emma is my biological daughter." Ms. Patterson looked up from the file, her expression shifting slightly. "The records show she lives with her mother full-time, with limited visitation rights for you. Can you explain that arrangement?" The question hit harder than Julian had expected. In business negotiations, he was accustomed to controlling narratives, presenting information in ways that supported his objectives. But there was no spinning the reality of his relationship with Emma The missed recitals, the cancelled weekends, the gradual erosion of connection that came from choosing work over presence. "I made mistakes," he said finally. "I prioritized my career over my family. The court awarded primary custody to my ex-wife because they felt I couldn't provide consistent emotional availability." Ms. Patterson made notes in his file, her expression neutral but telling. Julian realized that his confession had probably damaged his case, but lying would have been worse. The adoption process seemed designed to expose every weakness, every failure, every shortcoming that might impact a child's welfare. "Tell me about your understanding of Lila May's background," Ms. Patterson continued. "What do you know about children who have experienced trauma?" Julian found himself drawing on memories from conversations with Mrs. Rodriguez, research he had conducted in the sleepless hours after the gala, and fragments of understanding that felt inadequate to the challenge. She's lost her mother to addiction. She's been in temporary housing, probably seen things no child should see. She'll need therapy, patience, understanding that healing takes time. He paused, realizing how clinical his response sounded. But she also has this incredible strength, this connection to music that her mother gave her. She's not broken. She's someone who's survived things that would destroy most adults. For the first time since the interview began, Ms. Patterson's expression softened slightly. That's a surprisingly mature perspective. Most people see children in the system as damaged goods needing to be fixed. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics Julian had never considered: attachment disorders, grief cycles, the challenges of transracial adoption, the importance of maintaining connections to a child's cultural heritage. Each question revealed another layer of complexity, another way his privileged existence had insulated him from realities that Lila May had navigated since birth. "I want to be clear about something," Ms. Patterson said as the interview wound down. "The media attention surrounding your case has created pressure to expedite the process, but we won't compromise our standards. If you're approved for adoption, it will be because you've demonstrated genuine readiness to parent a child with complex needs. Not because you're wealthy or famous," Julian nodded, understanding that his usual advantages, money, influence, connections, were not only useless here but potentially counterproductive. The adoption process was designed to level playing fields, to evaluate character rather than assets. "There's one more thing," Ms. Patterson said, pulling a document from his file. "We require potential adoptive parents to complete a psychological evaluation. Dr. Rebecca Chen specializes in adoption assessments. She'll want to explore your motivations, emotional stability, capacity for attachment." The form she handed him looked innocuous enough: basic information, scheduling details, consent agreements. But Julian understood its significance. Someone would probe his psyche, examine his relationships, evaluate his fitness to parent based on criteria he couldn't manipulate or control. When would this evaluation take place? David asked. "As soon as possible. Dr. Chen has agreed to accommodate Mr. Ware's schedule, given the circumstances." Miss Patterson's tone suggested this accommodation was unusual and shouldn't be taken for granted. "She's quite thorough. Expect multiple sessions over several weeks." As they prepared to leave, Julian found himself thinking about Lila May, still staying at Sacred Heart's temporary housing while bureaucracy determined her future. She was probably practicing her song, carrying her mother's photograph, learning to hope for something she had been taught not to expect. "Ms. Patterson," he said, stopping at the door. "How do I see her? Lila May. How do I spend time with her while this process unfolds?" "Supervised visits can be arranged once you complete the psychological evaluation," she replied. "But remember, any contact between you and Lila May will be documented, evaluated, considered as part of our assessment. She's not a project to be managed, Mr. Ware. She's a little girl who's already experienced more loss than most adults. Don't add your name to the list of people who've disappointed her." The warning lingered as Julian and David left the building, emerging into afternoon sunlight that felt harsh after the fluorescent reality of bureaucratic evaluation. He had navigated complex mergers, hostile takeovers, and international negotiations. But none of those challenges had required him to examine his soul and find it worthy of a child's trust. His phone buzzed with messages from Marcus, interview requests, board meeting schedules, business opportunities that would have commanded his immediate attention just days ago. But Julian found himself thinking instead about a 6-year-old voice singing about finding somewhere to belong, and wondering whether he had the courage to become the somewhere she was looking for. Dr. Rebecca Chen's office occupied the top floor of a converted brownstone in the Upper West Side, its warm lighting and comfortable furniture designed to encourage disclosure rather than defense. Julian had arrived early for his 3rd session, his usual punctuality now motivated by genuine engagement rather than professional courtesy. Over the previous 2 weeks, Dr. Chen had proven to be a formidable interviewer, capable of asking questions that bypassed his carefully constructed persona and probed the unhealed wounds beneath. "You've been thinking about something since our last session," Dr. Chen observed as Julian settled into the familiar chair across from her desk. "Something that's been troubling you." Julian nodded, surprised by how accurately she could read his emotional state. Their previous conversation had focused on his relationship with Emma, the ways his pursuit of success had gradually eroded his capacity for present-moment connection with his daughter. But walking home afterward, he had been haunted by something else, a nagging sense that Lila May's story contained elements he didn't fully understand. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that Lila's mother was a singer. Julian began slowly. Maria Santos. She performed at clubs in the village, trying to support herself and her daughter through music. Dr. Chen made a note, but didn't interrupt. Having learned that Julian often needed time to work through complex thoughts aloud. "I've been in the music business for 25 years, Julian continued. "I've signed hundreds of artists, worked with thousands of performers. The name felt familiar, but I couldn't place it." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder that had been consuming his attention for the past 3 days. "I had my assistant research every Maria Santos who performed in Manhattan over the past decade. Most of the information was routine, immigration records, work permits, tax filings. But then we found this." Julian opened the folder and removed a contract dated 8 years earlier, the letterhead bearing the logo of Ware Entertainment in its earlier incarnation. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably his own, though he had no memory of signing it. Maria Santos. "Recording contract 2017, he read aloud, his voice carrying a tremor he hadn't expected. "Exclusive representation agreement, 3-year term with options for renewal." Dr. Chen leaned forward, understanding that this document represented more than a simple business transaction. "You signed her?" "Apparently," Julian said, though even seeing his own signature, he struggled to remember the woman or the circumstances. "But that's not all." He turned the page to reveal correspondence between Maria Santos and his legal department, letters pleading for modified terms, requests for advance payments to cover medical expenses, increasingly desperate attempts to exit a contract that had become financially impossible to fulfill. "She was pregnant," Julian said, reading from one of Maria's letters. "Lila. She was pregnant with Lila and couldn't travel for promotional tours. She asked for maternity leave, for modified performance schedules, for anything that would let her maintain the contract while caring for her child." The papers that followed painted a picture of systematic legal warfare, Ware Entertainment, demanding adherence to impossible terms, threatening lawsuits for breach of contract, ultimately driving Maria Santos into financial ruin through the same predatory practices Julian had perfected across hundreds of similar cases. "The final document is a settlement agreement," Julian continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "She surrendered all rights to her music, accepted financial liability for promotional costs, and agreed never to record professionally again. In exchange, we dropped the breach of contract lawsuit." Dr. Chen studied the papers Julian had spread across her coffee table, each document representing another step in the destruction of a young mother's dreams. "This was your standard practice?" "It was efficient," Julian said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Artists sign contracts they don't understand, agree to terms they can't fulfill. And when life intervenes, pregnancy, illness, family crisis, we protect our investment through legal enforcement." The revelation had hit him like a physical blow when Marcus had first uncovered the connection. For 8 years, Julian had been living in willful ignorance of what his business practices had cost Maria Santos specifically, though he had known in general terms that his contracts destroyed more dreams than they fulfilled. "She tried to rebuild her career afterward," Julian continued, turning to the final section of his research. But the settlement agreement included a non-compete clause that prevented her from recording with any major label. She was blacklisted, effectively, from the mainstream music industry. The documents showed Maria's subsequent spiral, small club performances, cash payments, increasingly desperate attempts to support herself and her daughter through an industry that had branded her untouchable. The timeline corresponded with Lila May's early childhood, years when her mother had been fighting not just addiction, but the systematic destruction of her professional prospects. She died owing medical bills she couldn't pay, working clubs that paid barely enough to cover rent, Julian said, his voice breaking slightly. And Lila May has been carrying her mother's musical legacy, not knowing that I was the one who destroyed it. Dr. Chen set down her pen and looked directly at Julian with an intensity that made him want to retreat. "How does this change how you understand your commitment to adopt her?" The question cut to the heart of what had been tormenting Julian since the discovery. Was his adoption offer genuine altruism or unconscious guilt? Could he truly provide the family Lila May deserved, or was he trying to assuage his conscience through a grand gesture that addressed symptoms rather than causes? "I don't know," Julian admitted, his usual confidence completely absent. "Part of me thinks I owe her this, that adopting her is the least I can do after what I took from her mother. But another part wonders if that's exactly the wrong reason to become someone's father." Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, allowing the weight of Julian's confession to settle between them. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trained to help clients find their own answers, rather than providing easy absolution. "What do you think Lila May needs most?" she asked. "A father who chooses her because he loves her," Julian said immediately, "not because he feels guilty about her mother." "And which are you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Julian realized that everything, his adoption application, his growing attachment to Lila May, his desire to somehow repair the damage his empire had inflicted, balanced on his ability to answer honestly. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I need to figure it out before I go any further with this process." Dr. Chen made notes while Julian sat in silence, processing the implications of his discovery. The contract with Maria Santos represented everything he had become: efficient, profitable, and utterly disconnected from the human cost of his success. But his reaction to learning about it, the genuine horror he felt at seeing the specific damage his practices had inflicted, suggested that something fundamental had shifted in his values. "There's something else," Julian said, reaching for the final document in his folder. "I found this among my mother's papers after she died. I'd forgotten about it until this week." The letter was in Eleanor Ware's careful handwriting, dated just months before her death. It was addressed to Julian but had never been sent. Apparently written during one of her late-night sessions at the piano when arthritis made sleep impossible. "My dearest Julian," he read aloud, his voice catching on his mother's words. "I watch you build your empire and I'm proud of your success, but I worry about what it's costing your soul. Music was meant to heal hearts, not break them. I pray that someday you'll remember why you loved it before you learned to sell it." The letter continued for several pages, documenting Eleanor's growing concern about her son's transformation from someone who appreciated music's emotional power to someone who viewed it purely as commodity. She had seen the change happening but hadn't known how to intervene, how to remind him that success without compassion was just elaborate emptiness. She knew, Julian said, folding the letter carefully. My mother knew what I was becoming, and she tried to warn me. If she were alive now, she would want me to help Lila May, but she would also want me to make sure I was doing it for the right reasons. Dr. Chen studied Julian's face as he processed the convergence of past and present. The way Maria Santos's destroyed dreams had led to her daughter's current vulnerability, and how his mother's unfulfilled hopes for his character had created this unexpected opportunity for redemption. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Julian looked at the documents spread before him, evidence of his capacity for both harm and healing, proof that his choices had consequences that extended far beyond quarterly profit reports. Somewhere across the city, Lila May was probably practicing her mother's song, unaware that the man who had publicly offered to adopt her was also the one who had systematically destroyed her mother's career. The truth would have to be told eventually. Lila May deserved to know the full story of her mother's struggles, including the role Julian had played in them. But first, he needed to decide whether he was truly ready to become the father she deserved, or whether his adoption offer was just another business transaction disguised as generosity. "I'm going to finish this evaluation," Julian said finally, "and then I'm going to tell Lila May the truth about her mother and me. After that, we'll see if she still wants a father who helped destroy her mother's dreams, or if she deserves better than someone trying to buy forgiveness through adoption." The recording studio in Julian's office building had been dormant for 3 years, its soundproof walls and professional equipment gathering dust since he had stopped pretending that his empire had anything to do with creating music rather than consuming it. But tonight, technician Tommy Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew and one of the few people Julian trusted with delicate work, was carefully transferring decades-old master recordings to digital format. "These tapes are in rough shape, Mr. Ware," Tommy said, adjusting levels on the mixing board with the precision of someone who understood that they were handling more than just audio data. "Some degradation, a few dropouts, but the performances are salvageable." Julian stood behind the glass partition, watching Tommy work with equipment that represented millions in investment, but had rarely been used for anything more meaningful than converting acquired masters for streaming distribution. Tonight felt different, like the studio was finally being used for its intended purpose. The master recordings of Maria Santos's unreleased album had been stored in Ware Entertainment's vault for 8 years, effectively buried by the legal settlement that had ended her career. Julian had spent the past week obtaining permission from the estate to access them, navigating the same legal system he had once used to silence her voice. As Tommy worked, Julian reviewed the psychological evaluation report that Dr. Chen had submitted to Children's Services that morning. Her assessment was nuanced, acknowledging both his emotional growth and the concerns that remained. "Mr. Ware demonstrates genuine remorse for past actions and shows evidence of developing empathy that was previously compartmentalized," she had written. "However, his motivation for adoption appears partially driven by guilt and a desire for redemption. While these motivations are not inherently disqualifying, they require careful monitoring to ensure the child's needs remain paramount." The evaluation had been brutally honest about Julian's shortcomings, his history of emotional unavailability, his tendency to use financial resources as substitutes for emotional connection, his pattern of prioritizing professional success over personal relationships. But it had also documented something else, a genuine transformation beginning to take root, a man recognizing the emptiness of his achievements and desperately seeking meaning beyond material success. "First track is ready," Tommy announced through the intercom. Maria Santos's voice filled the studio with heartbreaking clarity, a song about dreams deferred but not abandoned, about holding on to hope when the world seemed determined to crush it. The recording quality was professional, the arrangement sophisticated, the performance infused with the kind of raw emotion that no amount of studio manipulation could manufacture. Julian closed his eyes, remembering the contract negotiations that had led to these recordings never seeing commercial release. Maria Santos had been 24 then, a young mother trying to balance artistic ambition with financial necessity. He had seen her as another asset to be acquired, another talent to be monetized through contracts designed to benefit the label rather than the artist. She was good, Tommy said quietly when the song ended. Really good. Why didn't these ever get released? Because I was more interested in owning her music than sharing it, Julian replied. The admission carrying weight he was still learning to bear. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. Lila asks about you every day. Are you ready to see her? The question had consumed Julian's thoughts for weeks. Ms. Patterson had finally approved supervised visits, contingent on his psychological evaluation and his commitment to honesty about his motivations. But knowing he could see Lila May and being ready to face her with the truth about her mother were entirely different challenges. The door to the studio opened, and Marcus entered with the evening's final reports, board meeting minutes, financial summaries, and a stack of contracts requiring signature. Julian glanced at the familiar documents, distribution agreements, artist development deals, licensing arrangements, and realized they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The board wants to discuss the adoption situation, Marcus said carefully. Some members are concerned about potential liability, public relations implications, impact on company image. Julian looked up from the contracts, understanding that his business empire and his personal transformation were on a collision course. The board had tolerated his recent distraction because Ware Entertainment continued generating profits, but they were fundamentally uncomfortable with anything that prioritized sentiment over strategy. What kind of concerns? Julian asked, though he suspected he already knew. Chairman Morrison thinks the adoption makes you appear emotionally unstable, Marcus replied, consulting his notes with professional detachment. He's worried about investor confidence if you're perceived as making impulsive personal decisions that affect company operations. The irony wasn't lost on Julian, that the same board that had applauded his ruthless contract negotiations now viewed his attempt at human decency as a liability. They had supported him when he destroyed artists' careers, but questioned his judgment when he tried to repair the damage. Schedule a meeting for next week, Julian said finally. I'll address their concerns directly. As Marcus departed with the signed contracts, Julian returned his attention to the master recordings. Tommy had transferred 4 more tracks, each one revealing the depth of talent that Julian's legal machinery had systematically suppressed. Maria Santos had possessed not just technical skill but the rare ability to transform personal pain into universal truth, exactly the quality that made great music transcendent rather than merely commercial. The final track was a lullaby, clearly intended for Lila May, with lyrics that spoke of unconditional love and dreams that would outlive the dreamer. Maria's voice carried maternal tenderness that made Julian think of his own mother's bedtime songs. The way Eleanor Ware had used music to create safety and connection in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. That's everything, Tommy announced. 12 tracks, all transferred and mastered. What do you want me to do with them? Julian stared at the digital files displayed on Tommy's screen. Maria Santos's complete artistic legacy, rescued from legal limbo, but still trapped by the settlement agreement that prevented their commercial release. He had the power to free her music, to ensure that Lila May could someday hear her mother's full artistic vision. But doing so would require dismantling the very legal structure that had built his empire. Make copies, Julian said. One for Lila May and one for the vault. And Tommy, thank you for this. I know it's not your usual kind of work. Tommy removed his headphones and looked at Julian with the directness of someone young enough to speak truth without calculation. Mr. Ware, can I ask you something? Why now? Why are you suddenly interested in this old recording? The question deserved honesty, even though the truth was complicated enough to resist simple explanation. "Because I helped destroy the woman who made it," Julian said. "And now I'm trying to become worthy of raising her daughter." Tommy nodded slowly, understanding that he had been participating in something more significant than a technical transfer. For what it's worth, these recordings, they would have been hits. She had everything: voice, presence, songs that connect. The industry lost something when she got silenced. After Tommy left, Julian remained in the studio, surrounded by equipment that represented his transformation of art into commodity. The master recordings sat on his desk, like evidence in a trial where he was simultaneously prosecutor, defendant, and judge. Tomorrow, he would drive to Sacred Heart and tell Lila the truth about her mother's career and his role in ending it. He would offer her the recordings as both gift and confession, knowing that she might reject both him and the music once she understood their connection. His phone rang, Sarah calling from Connecticut. "Julian, Emma wants to talk to you." His daughter's voice came through the speaker with the careful formality of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from their father. "Dad, I saw on the news that you're adopting someone." "Possibly," Julian said, realizing that this conversation was long overdue. "Emma, there are things I need to explain. Are you trying to replace me?" The question was asked with the devastating directness that only children could manage. Julian's chest tightened as he recognized the fear beneath his daughter's careful words. "No, sweetheart, never. I'm trying to become the kind of father you deserve to have, the kind I should have been all along. I miss playing piano," Emma said quietly. "But I stopped because it reminded me of you not being there." The admission hit Julian like physical pain. His 11-year-old daughter had abandoned her musical passion because he had taught her that her interests were less important than his business commitments. "Emma, I want you to start playing again," Julian said, his voice breaking slightly. "And I want to be there to hear you this time. Really there, not sending Marcus with flowers." They talked for 20 more minutes, the longest conversation Julian and Emma had shared in years. She told him about school, friends, the books she was reading, and the songs she remembered from when she used to play. He listened with attention he had never given her before, understanding that this conversation was as important as any board meeting he had ever attended. After the call ended, Julian sat alone in the studio, surrounded by the artifacts of his transformation: Maria Santos's rescued recordings, his mother's unfulfilled hopes, and the growing possibility that he might become the father both Lila and Emma deserved. Tomorrow would bring the most difficult conversation of his life, when he would sit across from a 6-year-old and confess that he was responsible for destroying everything her mother had worked to build. But tonight, for the first time in years, Julian felt something approaching hope, not for absolution, which wasn't his to claim, but for the possibility that honesty might create space for healing. The master recordings represented more than musical legacy. They were proof that some things could be rescued from the wreckage of his former self, that redemption might be possible for someone willing to face the full cost of his actions and choose differently moving forward. The community room at Sacred Heart smelled of industrial disinfectant and hope, the particular combination that seemed to permeate places where people tried to build something better from whatever pieces remained. Julian sat at a small table designed for children, his expensive suit looking absurdly formal in the space filled with donated toys and handmade artwork. The CD player he had brought sat between them like a bridge between worlds, its simple plastic housing containing 8 years of buried truth. Lila entered with Mrs. Rodriguez, her purple backpack slung over one shoulder, and her mother's photograph clutched in her free hand. She had grown thinner during the weeks since the gala, her face carrying the careful watchfulness of someone who had learned that promises from adults often dissolved without explanation. "Mr. Ware," she said formally, taking the seat across from him with the gravity of someone attending an important business meeting. Julian felt his carefully prepared words scatter like leaves in the wind. He had practiced this conversation for days, rehearsing explanations that would be age-appropriate yet honest. But looking at Lila May's solemn face, he realized that she deserved nothing less than complete truth, delivered with the respect due to someone who had already survived more than most adults ever would. "Lila May," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "I need to tell you something about your mother. Something important." She nodded, setting her mother's photograph on the table between them, with the reverence of someone placing flowers on a grave. The image showed Maria Santos in better days, before addiction and desperation had worn away her smile, but even in the faded photograph, the resemblance to her daughter was unmistakable. "Your mama was a singer," Julian continued, "a really talented singer. Did you know that?" "She sang to me," Lila May replied quietly, "every night before bed until she got too sick to remember the words." The simple statement carried implications that made Julian's chest tighten. He realized that Lila May's last memories of her mother might be of confusion and deterioration. Addiction stealing not just Maria's life, but her ability to maintain the musical connection that had bonded them. "Before she got sick," Julian said carefully, "your mama made an album, professional recordings in a real studio, with musicians and everything. Beautiful songs that she wrote herself." Lila May's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her careful composure. "Really?" "Really," Julian confirmed, placing his hand on the CD player. "I have those recordings. I've brought them for you." He pressed play, and Maria Santos's voice filled the small room with crystalline clarity. The first song was an up-tempo piece about chasing dreams through city streets, young and hopeful and infused with the kind of optimism that comes from believing the future holds infinite possibility. Lila May went perfectly still, her eyes closing as her mother's voice surrounded her. Tears began streaming down her face, but she didn't make a sound, listening with the intensity of someone hearing a voice from heaven. When the song ended, she opened her eyes and looked directly at Julian. "Where did you get this?" The question he had been dreading, delivered with the directness of someone who understood that adults often obscured truth rather than sharing it. "That's what I need to tell you," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I work in the music business. I own a company that makes contracts with singers, helps them record albums and sell their music to radio stations and stores." Lila May nodded, waiting for the rest of the story with the patience of someone accustomed to hearing bad news delivered in careful stages. 8 years ago, when you were still a baby, your mama signed a contract with my company. She was going to be a star. She had everything needed to be successful. But then Julian stopped, realizing that no amount of preparation could make this confession easier to deliver. "But then what?" Lila May asked, her voice carrying no accusation, only the desire to understand. "But then you were born," Julian said, "and your mama couldn't travel for concerts anymore. She needed to stay home and take care of you. She asked if we could change the contract, make it so she could still record music, but not travel so much." Lila May was watching him with an intensity that made him feel transparent, as if she could see through his explanations to the truth beneath. "We said no," Julian continued, the words coming out like physical pain. "We said she had to follow the original contract exactly, or we would sue her for breaking her promise. I made it impossible for her to be both a mother and a singer." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing from across the room, stepped closer, her protective instincts clearly activated. "What happened to the songs?" Lila May asked finally. "We kept them," Julian admitted. "We owned them because of the contract, but we never released them. They've been sitting in a vault for 8 years, while your mama tried to rebuild her career with other companies." Lila May picked up her mother's photograph, studying the image as if seeing it for the first time. When she looked up again, her expression had changed. Not angry, exactly, but older somehow, as if Julian's confession had added years to her understanding of how the world worked. "You're the reason she couldn't sing anymore," she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Yes, Julian replied, offering no excuse or justification. I am? Lila May sat in perfect silence for what felt like an eternity, her small hands folded over her mother's photograph, her eyes fixed on Julian's face with an intensity that made him want to retreat from the magnitude of what he had confessed. Mrs. Rodriguez had moved closer, her presence a reminder that this conversation involved not just truth-telling, but the emotional welfare of a child who had already endured more loss than anyone should carry. "Why are you telling me this?" Lila May asked finally, her voice carrying a weariness that belonged to someone much older. Julian had prepared for anger, for tears, for rejection, but her quiet acceptance was somehow more devastating than any emotional outburst would have been. She was processing his confession with the resigned understanding of someone who had learned early that adults often caused more harm than help, even when they claimed good intentions. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Julian said. "And because I can't ask you to trust me with your future if I'm not honest about my past." "Do you feel sorry for what you did?" she asked, tilting her head with the directness that children bring to moral questions adults prefer to complicate. "Yes," Julian replied without hesitation. "More sorry than I know how to express. Sorry enough to give Mama her songs back." The question hit Julian like a physical blow. In all his preparation for this conversation, he had focused on confession and contrition, but Lila May was asking about action, whether his remorse would translate into concrete change that honored her mother's memory. "The legal agreements are complicated," Julian began, then stopped himself, recognizing that he was falling back into the language of evasion that had allowed him to justify years of harmful decisions. "Yes," he said simply, "I'm going to release your mother's album, all of it, so the world can hear how talented she was." For the first time since entering the room, Lila May's composure cracked slightly. "People will hear Mama sing?" "Everyone will hear her sing," Julian promised, understanding that this commitment would require dismantling portions of his business empire, but feeling no hesitation about that cost. "And all the money from the songs, everything that belongs to you." Lila May nodded, processing this information with the same careful deliberation she had shown throughout their conversation. Julian realized that he was witnessing something remarkable, a 6-year-old making sense of complex moral territory with more wisdom than he had demonstrated in decades of business dealings. "Mr. Ware," she said, using his formal name with the gravity of someone conducting important business. "Do you want to adopt me because you feel bad about Mama, or because you want to be my daddy?" The question cut to the heart of everything Dr. Chen had helped him examine, everything he had wrestled with during sleepless nights since discovering his connection to Maria Santos. The honest answer was complicated, involving guilt and redemption and genuine affection, but Lila May deserved clarity rather than psychological complexity. "At first, it was because I felt bad," Julian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now it's because I love you. Because when I hear you sing, I remember what music is supposed to feel like. Because you're brave and strong and kind, and you deserve a family that understands how special you are." Lila May studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read adult motivations for signs of safety or danger. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal evaluation, because her expression softened slightly. "I don't think I can call you Daddy right away," she said carefully. "Maybe just Julian for now?" The statement was delivered without cruelty, simply as a statement of fact from someone who understood that trust was earned through consistent action rather than granted through legal documents. "Julian is perfect," he replied, feeling more honored by her conditional acceptance than he had by any business success in his career. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward, her weathered face showing approval for how the conversation had unfolded. "Lila May, you've been very brave today. Are you ready to think about what comes next?" Lila May nodded, then looked directly at Julian with an expression that seemed to contain both her mother's wisdom and her own hard-earned understanding of how the world worked. want to keep living here until you prove you're going to stay," she said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone setting reasonable boundaries. "And I want to visit Emma, your other daughter. I should meet her before we decide to be a family." Julian felt his throat tighten at her instinctive understanding that adoption meant joining an existing family structure rather than creating an entirely new one. Somewhere in her 6 years of life, Lila May had learned that real families were built through patience and consistency rather than dramatic gestures. "That sounds very wise," Julian said. "Emma would like that. She's been asking about you." "Good," Lila May replied, then hesitated before adding, "Julian, can we listen to more of Mama's songs?" He pressed play on the CD player, and Maria Santos's voice once again filled the small room. This time, Julian found himself truly listening, not as a businessman evaluating commercial potential, but as someone learning to understand music the way his mother had taught him, the way Lila May instinctively knew it should be heard. As the song played, Lila May closed her eyes and began humming along, her pure voice intertwining with her mother's recorded legacy in a moment that felt like healing made audible. Julian understood that whatever happened next, whether the adoption was approved, whether he proved worthy of her trust, this moment represented something precious that couldn't be taken away. For the first time in decades, Julian felt the presence of something larger than profit margins and market share. It felt like grace. 6 months later, Julian sat at his mother's piano watching 2 girls bent over sheet music, their heads close together as they worked through a duet arrangement of Somewhere to Belong. Emma had arrived from Connecticut the previous evening. Her weekend visits now extended to full weeks during school breaks. Her initial wariness toward Lila May having evolved into protective sisterhood. The adoption had been finalized 3 weeks earlier in a ceremony that bore no resemblance to the grand spectacle Julian might have orchestrated in his former life. Just him, Lila May, Mrs. Rodriguez, and Emma in a courthouse room where Judge Martinez had asked Lila May directly whether she understood what adoption meant and whether Julian had proven himself worthy of being called her father. "He's getting better at it," Lila May had replied with the diplomatic honesty that had become her trademark, earning laughter from everyone present, including Julian himself. The relationship had developed slowly, built through consistent presence rather than dramatic gestures. Julian had restructured his entire business model, personally reviewing every artist contract to eliminate the predatory clauses that had destroyed careers like Maria's. Several board members had resigned in protest, unable to reconcile fiduciary responsibility with what they considered emotional decision-making. But the company's reputation had actually improved as word spread that Ware Entertainment now treated artists as partners rather than acquisitions. Maria Santos's posthumous album had been released 2 months earlier to critical acclaim and commercial success, with all proceeds going into a trust fund for Lila May's education and future. The collection had sparked conversations about exploitation in the music industry, leading to regulatory changes that protected vulnerable artists from the kind of contracts Julian had once considered standard practice. "The bridge is tricky," Emma was explaining to Lila May, her fingers moving across the keys with growing confidence. She had resumed piano lessons immediately after their first conversation, approaching her musical education with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. "Mama always said the tricky parts teach you the most," Lila May replied, attempting the complicated chord progression with determined focus. Julian smiled at the exchange, recognizing how naturally the girls had found their rhythm together. Emma's initial jealousy had transformed into something approaching reverence once she understood Lila May's history and resilience. In turn, Lila May had gained not just a sister but a window into the kind of childhood that financial security could provide. Lessons that came through experience, rather than lectures about gratitude. Dr. Chen had been right about the complexity of his motivations for adoption. Guilt had indeed been part of his initial impulse, but it had been transmuted through daily reality into something more sustainable. Genuine love for a remarkable child who had taught him that healing was possible for those willing to do the difficult work of change. Julian. Lila May called from the piano bench. Can you help us with this part? The request was casual now, delivered with the confidence of someone who had learned that asking for help didn't mean admitting weakness. Julian approached the piano, settling beside the girls on the bench his mother had occupied during his own childhood lessons. His fingers found the keys with an ease that surprised him, muscle memory intact despite years of avoidance. The duet they were working on was Lila May's arrangement of her mother's song, adapted for 2 pianos but playable by 2 children learning to make music together. As they played, Julian felt his mother's presence in the room, not as grief or loss, but as approval for the man he was becoming. Millionaire Ware had believed that music could heal hearts and connect souls across any distance. Watching her granddaughters learn to harmonize, Julian understood that she had been right about music's essential purpose. "That's beautiful," he said when they finished, his voice carrying genuine pride rather than obligatory encouragement. "We want to perform it at the foundation benefit next month," Emma announced. "If that's okay with you." The annual Millionaire Ware Foundation benefit had been transformed along with everything else in Julian's life. Instead of elaborate galas designed to impress donors, the event now featured performances by students from the scholarship programs, turning fundraising into celebration of the foundation's actual impact. "I think your grandmother would love that," Julian replied, imagining Eleanor's reaction to seeing her granddaughters making music together in the living room, where she had spent her final years dreaming of reconciliation between her son and his calling. Later that evening, after Emma had returned to her homework and Lila May had finished her nightly ritual of looking at her mother's photograph before sleep, Julian found himself alone at the piano. This time, instead of simply touching the keys, he opened his mother's composition, the piece she had written for him decades earlier. The notes came slowly at first, his fingers relearning coordination that business success had never required. But as he progressed through the melody, Julian heard his mother's voice in the harmonies. Her hopes for his character spelled out in musical language that transcended spoken words. The piece was about transformation, not the dramatic reinvention that ego demanded, but the gradual healing that came from choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, service over exploitation. His mother had somehow anticipated the man he might become if he ever learned to listen to the music beneath the noise of his ambitions. When he finished playing, Julian sat in the gentle silence of his apartment, surrounded by evidence of the life he was still learning to live. Lila May's purple backpack hung on a chair in the kitchen, Emma's sheet music scattered across the coffee table, photographs of both girls now mixed among the business awards that had once defined his identity. Outside his windows, the city continued its restless movement, millions of people pursuing their own versions of success and happiness. But here, in this space where his mother's piano had waited patiently for him to remember its purpose, Julian had finally found what Millionaire Ware had always known he was looking for. Not another achievement to accumulate, but a reason to be grateful for each ordinary, extraordinary day of becoming the father his daughters deserved. Sometimes the most broken hearts really did hide behind the biggest smiles. But sometimes, if you were very fortunate, a small voice singing an old song could teach you how to heal.